Imagine standing in the middle of a tropical paradise, surrounded by turquoise waters and smiling faces, yet feeling the cold, gripping terror of imminent death. This isn't a survival movie. This was the reality for a man named Ivan, a seasoned traveler from St. Petersburg who prided himself on his resilience and stoicism. He arrived in the Philippines expecting a month of leisure, island hopping, and cultural exploration. But a single moment of distraction at a bustling provincial bus terminal turned his dream vacation into a harrowing nightmare. One minute, he was checking the schedule for a ferry to a remote island. The next, he realized his backpack, containing his passport, his cards, his cash, and his phone, was gone. He was thousands of miles from home, in a town where he didn't speak the language, with absolutely zero resources. What followed was a 3-day descent into a personal hell that would strip him of his dignity, his strength, and nearly his life, only to end in a twist so unexpected that it challenges everything we think we know about poverty and wealth. The first 24 hours were a blur of adrenaline and disbelief, a frantic attempt to retrace steps that had long since vanished into the dusty chaos of the streets. Ivan tried to communicate with local authorities, but the language barrier was a thick wall. His aggressive Russian cadence was mistaken for anger, and his desperation was met with confused stares rather than assistance. He spent that first night sitting on a concrete curb outside a closed convenience store, the neon lights buzzing above him like a cruel joke, illuminating the snacks and water he couldn't touch. The tropical heat, usually a comforting blanket for a tourist, became an oppressive weight, draining the moisture from his body as he watched stray dogs scavenge for scraps. He told himself he could handle this, that his military training and harsh winters back home had prepared him for endurance, but he quickly learned that hunger in a humid, foreign land strikes with a different kind of violence. By the morning of the second day, the adrenaline had faded, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache in his temples and a stomach that felt like it was twisting itself into knots. Ivan began walking, driven by a primal need to find a solution, perhaps an internet cafe that would let him use a computer on a promise of future payment, or a fellow tourist who might speak English or Russian. But he was far off the beaten path, in a sleepy coastal town not frequented by foreigners. The sun beat down relentlessly, and every step required a conscious effort of will. He watched street vendors grilling pork skewers, the sweet and savory smoke drifting into his face, taunting him. He saw people drinking ice-cold sodas, the condensation dripping down the bottles, and for the first time in his life, he considered stealing. The thought terrified him. He was a man of honor, a man with a career and a life, yet here he was, eyeing an unattended bottle of water on a bench like a predator. He retreated to the shade of a coconut tree on the public beach, his lips cracked and dry, forcing himself to sleep just to escape the gnawing emptiness in his gut. Day 3 was when the hallucinations began, subtle at first, a familiar voice calling his name in the crashing waves, the smell of his mother's borscht mixing with the salty sea air. He was severely dehydrated, his vision swimming with black spots every time he tried to stand. The pride that had prevented him from begging on the first day had completely evaporated, but his voice was too weak to shout. He sat by the roadside, a hulking figure reduced to a shadow, watching the tricycles buzz by. He looked terrifying to the locals, a large, sunburned, unkempt foreigner with wild eyes, so they kept their distance, assuming he was drunk or dangerous. He felt invisible, a ghost haunting a vibrant town. He remembers closing his eyes as the sun began to set, the orange light fading behind the palm trees, and genuinely accepting that he might just slip away right there, another anonymous statistic in a beautiful place. He had stopped sweating, a dangerous sign of heat stroke, and his thoughts became disjointed, focusing only on the rhythm of his shallow breathing. It was in this state of semi-consciousness that he felt a rough hand on his shoulder, shaking him not with malice, but with urgent concern. Ivan flinched, expecting the police to arrest him for vagrancy, or perhaps a local gang looking for trouble. Instead, he looked up to see a weather-beaten face, deeply tanned and lined by years of hard labor under the sun. It was a tricycle driver, a man perhaps in his 50s, wearing a faded basketball jersey and flip-flops. The man didn't speak English, and Ivan couldn't speak Tagalog, but the universal language of distress required no translation. The driver, whom we will call Mang Nilo, pointed to Ivan's cracked lips and sunken eyes, then mimed the motion of drinking. Ivan nodded weakly. He tried to explain he had no money, tapping his empty pockets and shaking his head vigorously, but Mang Nilo simply waved his hand dismissively. With surprising strength, the small Filipino man hoisted the large Russian tourist up, supporting his weight, and guided him not to a hospital or a police station, but toward his rusty, sidecar motorcycle. The ride was short and bumpy, the wind providing a momentary relief from the stifling heat, but Ivan remained tense, his mind racing with cynical thoughts. Why was this man helping him? Was he being taken to a secluded spot to be held for ransom? It seemed illogical to kidnap a man with nothing, yet fear often overrides logic. The tricycle turned off the paved road and navigated a maze of narrow dirt paths, winding through a shanty town of plywood houses and corrugated metal roofs. The poverty was stark. Naked children ran through the dirt, chickens pecked at the ground, and the smell of burning charcoal filled the air. They stopped in front of a tiny, patchwork structure that looked like it might collapse in a strong wind. Mang Nilo gestured for him to enter. Ivan hesitated, his legs trembling, but the smell of cooking rice wafted from inside, and his body moved on its own accord, drawn toward the promise of sustenance. Inside, the home was essentially one room, clean but incredibly sparse, with a floor made of bamboo slats that creaked under Ivan's heavy boots. A woman, presumably Mang Nilo's wife, looked up from a small gas stove, her eyes widening in surprise at the giant stranger filling their doorway. Nilo spoke to her rapidly in the local dialect, his tone soft and explanatory. Her expression shifted from shock to immediate concern. She didn't ask questions. She didn't ask for payment. She simply grabbed a plastic pitcher of water and a tin cup. Ivan drank the water so fast he choked, the liquid life rushing into his system. She refilled it, and he drank again, and again. For the first time in 3 days, the fog in his brain began to clear, allowing him to truly look at his surroundings. There was no furniture, just mats rolled up in the corner and a small altar with religious statues. This family had almost nothing, yet they had just invited a complete stranger into their sanctuary. The meal they served him was humble by any standard, but to Ivan, it was a Michelin star feast. A mound of steaming white rice, a small fried fish, and a bowl of clear broth with green leafy vegetables. As he ate, voraciously shoveling the food into his mouth with a spoon, he noticed something that made his heart stop. There were 3 children sitting in the corner, watching him with wide, curious eyes. They weren't eating. He looked at the pot on the stove and realized it was empty. He looked at Nilo and his wife, who were sipping only broth. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They had given him their dinner. This wasn't extra food. This was the food. They were sacrificing their own meal to feed a foreigner they didn't know, a man who, by all appearances, came from a world of wealth compared to theirs. Overwhelmed with guilt, Ivan tried to push the plate toward the children, insisting in broken English, "No, for you, for you." Nilo gently pushed the plate back, smiling a toothy, genuine smile, and said one of the few English words he knew, "Guest." That single word carried the weight of a culture Ivan was only just beginning to understand. In the Philippines, the concept of hospitality isn't about grand gestures when you have plenty. It's about sharing even when you have nothing. It is a deep-seated cultural value that treats a stranger not as a threat, but as a responsibility. Ivan ate the rest of the meal with tears streaming down his face, the salt mixing with the rice. It wasn't just the relief of ending his hunger. It was the sheer, crushing humility of receiving such pure kindness. He had traveled the world, seen monuments and skyscrapers, but he had never seen anything as magnificent as this family's generosity in that bamboo shack. As night fell, the family prepared to sleep. There was no guest room, of course. They simply unrolled a woven mat on the floor for Ivan, giving him the spot near the electric fan, the most comfortable place in the house. Nilo and his family slept clustered together on the other side of the room. Lying there in the dark, listening to the hum of the fan and the breathing of the people who had saved him, Ivan felt a sense of safety he hadn't experienced even in the most expensive hotels. He thought about his wallet, his lost money, his anger at the thief, and suddenly, none of it mattered. He realized he was witnessing wealth in a different form. These people possessed a richness of spirit that his credit cards could never buy. He drifted off to sleep, not as a stranded tourist, but as a member of a human tribe that looked out for one another. The next morning, the news of the giant guest had spread through the neighborhood. Ivan woke up to find neighbors peeking through the open door and windows. He braced himself for ridicule, but instead, he was met with a community effort. One neighbor brought a packet of instant coffee, another brought sweet bread known as pandesal. They didn't see a rich Russian tourist. They saw a human being in trouble. Nilo had apparently explained the situation. A young woman who spoke decent English approached Ivan. She explained that she worked at a call center in the city and had a smartphone with data. She offered to let him use it to contact his family or the embassy. It was the lifeline he needed. With shaking hands, he logged into his social media, sent urgent messages to his brother in St. Petersburg, and located the contact information for the nearest consulate. The logistics of his rescue began to fall into place, but the emotional weight of the experience only grew heavier. While waiting for a reply and a money transfer to a local pawn shop, Ivan spent the day with Nilo. He watched the man work, fixing his tricycle, laughing with his neighbors, playing with his children. Ivan saw that despite the harshness of their economic reality, there was a joy and lightness to their lives that confused him. In his culture, and indeed in much of the West, happiness was often tied to achievement and accumulation. Here, happiness seemed to be tied to connection and resilience. He helped Nilo carry water buckets from the communal pump, a small gesture to repay the massive debt he felt. The physical labor felt good. It felt honest. For a few hours, the barrier between tourist and local completely dissolved. When the confirmation finally came that money had been wired to a nearby remittance center, Ivan felt a pang of sadness. He retrieved the funds, enough to buy a new phone, pay for a hotel, and get back to the capital. He returned to Nilo's house with pockets full of cash, intending to pay them. He pulled out a stack of pesos, an amount that could feed the family for months. He tried to press it into Nilo's hand. To his shock, Nilo pulled back. The driver looked offended, shaking his head. "No money," Nilo said firmly. "Friend." Ivan insisted, explaining it was for the food, for the lodging, for saving his life. Nilo eventually accepted a small amount, only enough to cover the cost of the food and gas, and refused a single centavo more. He pointed to his heart and then to Ivan. The message was clear: kindness is not a transaction. The goodbye was one of the hardest moments of Ivan's life. He hugged Nilo, the wife, and the children. He felt the coarse texture of Nilo's work-worn hands and looked into his eyes one last time. He promised to return, not as a victim of circumstance, but as a friend. As he rode away in a different tricycle toward the city, looking back at the small shanty disappearing into the dust, Ivan realized he was leaving with more than he had arrived with. He had lost his passport and his money, yes, but he had found a restored faith in humanity. He had arrived looking for a tropical vacation and found a lesson on the soul. The landscape was beautiful, but the people were the true wonder of the Philippines. Weeks later, back in the cold, grey streets of St. Petersburg, Ivan found himself changed. The expensive coffee he used to drink didn't taste as good as the instant 3-in-1 mixture he had shared with Nilo. He found himself looking at the people around him differently, wondering who among them would open their doors to a stranger. He started a fundraising campaign online, telling his story not as a tragedy, but as a testimony to Filipino hospitality. The response was overwhelming. People weren't just moved by his hunger, they were moved by the family's generosity. He sent the money not just to Nilo, but to the entire neighborhood, funding a new water pump and school supplies for the children. This story isn't just about a tourist who got lost. It's a mirror held up to our own values. We often fear what we don't know. We fear the bad neighborhoods, the foreign streets, the people who look different from us. Ivan's 3 days of starvation stripped away those prejudices. When he was at his lowest, when he had absolutely nothing to offer, he wasn't saved by a government agency or a wealthy philanthropist. He was saved by a man who had to skip dinner so his guest could eat. It challenges the very definition of poor. If you have nothing, but you give everything, are you poor? Or are you the richest person in the room? The shock of this story lies in the subversion of expectations. In a cynical world, we expect the vulnerable tourist to be exploited. We expect the story to end in a crime report. Instead, it ended in a brotherhood. It reminds us that while news headlines often focus on the darkness of the world, the light is found in the quiet, unpublicized corners, in a bamboo shack, over a plate of dried fish and rice. It serves as a reminder that empathy is hardwired into us, and sometimes it takes a disaster to remind us of our shared humanity. Ivan eventually returned to the Philippines a year later. He didn't stay in a five-star resort. He went straight back to that dusty town. He sat on the floor with Nilo, shared a drink, and laughed, no longer needing a translator to understand the bond they shared. He learned that while you can lose your money, your passport, and your way, kindness is the one currency that is universal, valid in every country, and never devalues. His 3 days of hunger were the price he paid for the greatest meal of his life, not the food itself, but the love with which it was served. So, the next time you travel, or even the next time you walk down your own street, look at the people around you. Remember that beneath the surface, beneath the language barriers and cultural differences, there is a capacity for goodness that can save a life. Ivan's story is a testament to the Filipino spirit of bayanihan, communal unity and cooperation, but it is also a universal call to action. We all have the capacity to be Nilo. We all have the capacity to open the door. Ultimately, the Russian tourist lost his wallet, but he gained a family. He starved for 3 days so that his soul could be fed. And in a world that often feels divided and cold, that is a story worth telling, a story worth sharing, and a reminder that sometimes, the worst thing that happens to you can lead to the best thing that ever happened to you. The shocking part wasn't the starvation. It was the overwhelming, unconditional love that ended it.